I am Paul Capetz, a Presbyterian minister, though I'm currently serving as the pastor of a Methodist church in California. And I was a professor at theological seminaries for 28 years in the United States. I taught at 4 different theological seminaries. In the field that's called historical theology, which is an old-fashioned term, it's not used much anymore these days, but it refers to the history of Christian theology that's a part of the larger history of the Christian church on its intellectual side. And I think it's called historical theology in much the same way that Old Testament studies is sometimes called Old Testament theology, or New Testament studies is sometimes called New Testament theology. The people who use those designations understand their historical work, whether in Old Testament, New Testament, or church history, to be serving a theological purpose, to be contributing to the larger understanding of Christian faith. So usually within a theological curriculum. So I've also taught at some colleges and universities, but in the field of what's called religious studies, not theology. And that's a big division these days in the United States. In those contexts, we would never speak of historical theology. We'd speak of the history of the church or the history of theology or some such thing, because there would be no normative dimension. You would simply be trying to describe what people in the past said was the meaning of Christian faith, like Augustine, Aquinas, Luther, Schleiermacher, Barth. But I think that historical theology adds a different dimension than mere description, because you're trying to engage in a conversation with these great theological figures of the past for the sake of clarifying what we should understand by Christian faith today. So I always understood myself first and foremost as a theologian, and all of my historical work has been put in the service of trying to understand what Christian faith really is and why I think it's true. I was first called to be a minister before I ever entered academics. So all of my academic work as a scholar and as a professor has always been in the service of the task of the ministry of the Protestant churches. At seminaries, as I did for most of my career, I was teaching people who, by and large, were preparing to become ordained ministers themselves. And so when I was teaching them the history of theology, I always did it with a view towards helping them to think themselves about the big issues of Christian systematic theology, even if we were studying the history of theology. The book came about unintentionally. At least it wasn't my intention. It came about because I was a member of a group of constructive theologians who met on an annual basis at Vanderbilt Divinity School. We were called the Work Group in Constructive Theology. And we were sponsored by Fortress Press. We were writing a book together on constructive theology, and I was in the group that was writing the chapter on the Christian doctrine of God. And I wrote a very long, I think it was about 40-page essay for that little group within the larger work group that was dedicated to studying the doctrine of God, for the sake of clarifying to them my own beliefs about the systematic issues that needed to be addressed in a contemporary doctrine of God. And I did it by trying to trace in very large strokes the history of the Christian doctrine of God and identifying places where I thought problems had been created for subsequent theology. So like most of the work that I've done, it's been both historical and constructive at the same time. The paper was eventually circulated beyond the small group of people who were working on that particular chapter, including the editor at Fortress Press, who was part of our group, Michael, I can't remember his last name right now. At any rate, he was very impressed with the paper, and he thought that it could be enlarged and made into a little book belonging to a series of books that Fortress was publishing called Facets. He asked me if I would write a larger essay, and I agreed to do so. And there were severe page limitations that I could not observe. I think I was supposed to only have 100 pages, and I ended up having 180 pages. And and that's why it would be possible to criticize the book as being superficial or something, or not going in depth enough. But given the nature of the series, I had to plead for every page I got. But it was an interesting exercise. I think the distinctive contribution of the book lies in a thesis that I came to as a result not only of this book, but prior to that, in trying to, I had written lectures for a number of years for a 2-semester historical theology course at the seminary I was taking that was introducing students to the whole history of Christian theology. And the more I wrote those lectures and studied those materials, trying to make sense of it all to students, I came to believe that Christianity is an extremely complex religion from the theological perspective. That is to say, its theology is not as easy to understand as, say, Islam or Judaism or perhaps Buddhism. You see what I mean? I know there's a lot of complex Buddhist philosophy out there, but Christianity strikes me as having a very complex history of theological interpretation. And so I asked myself, what is the source of this complexity? And I came to believe that it had to do with the origins of Christianity at the intersection of Judaism and Hellenism. That, Tertullian formulated this classical question, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? Well, my answer is absolutely everything, because Christianity wouldn't be what it is had it not been for that convergence between those two traditions of Israel and Greece. And yet, those two traditions themselves, at the time of the emergence of Christianity, were both internally diverse. That is to say, Hellenism was not a single tradition. It contained multiple philosophical perspectives on religion and the gods or God. Judaism was not monolithic either. It was internally diverse. And there were those who were open to Hellenism and those who were trying to close the doors on Hellenism. What I came to believe and argued in the closing pages of my little book on God is that Christianity in its theological dimension would not be what it has become had it not been for this coalescence of two internally diverse theological traditions, which accounts for and sufficiently explains, I believe, the internal diversity in the history of Christianity. Because what I argued is that all of the great theologies in the history of the church can be understood as drawing upon these aspects of Judaism and those aspects of Hellenism, or conversely, those aspects of Judaism and these aspects of Hellenism. In other words, you have such a multitude of possibilities that can be brought together from both traditions and rearranged in different combinations. And I think that's the distinctive contribution of the book in that thesis. And I did not learn that thesis from reading someone else. It came to me as a result of studying the material and trying to make sense of it to students. The other insight of the book, I guess that's the second thesis of the book, is just how systematic Christian theology is. Even if you're debating something as arcane as sacramental theology in the 16th century, you're still reflecting positions that were debated Christologically in the 4th and 5th centuries, which of course are also positions about God. You're always talking about God, even if you're talking about something that doesn't seem to be directly related to God, like the Eucharist or something like that. Well, let me say another word about this, because this comes close to my heart. I think Americans are notoriously anti-historical in their orientation. This is true in theology and politics and many other America was a nation that was founded by Europeans trying to escape European history. A truly historical understanding of religion and theology is an imperative in our time, not only for Christians, but also for members of other religions and non-religious people altogether. Religions did not fall out of the sky, were not revealed by God in some kind of supernatural fashion, complete and whole. And many people are working very naively with ahistorical assumptions, that is, non-historical assumptions, without admitting that things changed over time. So, for example, I teach a Bible study every week at my church, and we've been working through the Old Testament since the outbreak of the pandemic. None of these people have gone to seminary. I mean, they shouldn't have. They're not ministers. But I try to introduce the idea that Israel didn't always think the same things about its God. So, we began with Genesis, and now we're in the book of Ruth. We've worked our way through the Pentateuch, and we're in the midst of the Deuteronomistic history, and we're reading the book of Ruth, which was inserted between Judges and 1 Samuel. For some of my people in the congregation, they don't quite know what to make of some of the things that the Old Testament says about God, because it's so different from what they believe as Christians. And so I'm trying to introduce a historical perspective that allows them to realize that Israel's theology developed over time, and that Israel's theology wasn't originally monotheistic, that was a huge revolution in its thought, probably occasioned by the Babylonian exile. And, for some of them, they appreciate that insight. For others, they can't quite grasp it. And for others, they resist it because it seems to upset the idea that God inspired every word of the Bible. But I think it's true. I think you really can't understand what's going on in the Bible unless you take a historical perspective. For me, when I first learned as a teenager about the historical critical method of interpreting the Bible, for me, that was so eye-opening. It made the Bible into a human book that I could understand. And I am sure that I would not be a Christian today had I not encountered that modern historical critical way of reading the Bible. If I came to Korea to visit, and I would love to do so someday, the first thing I would do after buying my plane ticket is read a book, a good book I'd ask somebody, what's the best book on Korean history? Because that would open to me what I would encounter in Korea. See what I mean? Everybody has a history, whether they acknowledge it or not, And that means things changed. I'm sure that 16th century Korea is not like 21st century Korea, right? I'm sure Korea is different before the Korean War. You see what I mean? These are just self-evident statements, but if you take them seriously, it means that who we are is because of what happened in history. The decisions our ancestors made, the things that happened to our ancestors. I'm sure that I believe that as a scholar and a teacher, one is supposed to open up questions, not shut them down. And when I taught any class, whatever it was in my 28 years as a professor, I was there to open the minds of people. So one of the best comments I ever received from a student after taking my 2-semester historical theology class, she said to me, when your class first began last semester and you were talking about these early church fathers, I thought you were talking about your own theology because you presented those theologians so passionately as if they were telling us the very gospel truth. But then as the course went on and we went into the second semester, I realized you couldn't possibly be giving us your own theology because these theologians virulently disagreed with one another. And yet every time you came to the next theologian, you presented him as if he were teaching us the gospel truth. I realized that you presented each person in the best possible light to make us think. But I don't really know now what you think, Professor Capetz. And I said to her, You got the point of the course. I think, it's been a while since I wrote that book. So your questions made me think again about things that I haven't thought about for a while. I chose Kaufman and Gustafson to end the book because they are continuing that line of reflection that H. Richard Niebuhr began as what exactly is radical monotheism? What exactly is the nature of the God that Jews and Christians believe in, and Muslims, we should say as well, that began in biblical Israel? I think that's a very distinctive understanding of God that emerged in ancient Israel. And that's the foundation, the presupposition of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And like H. Richard Niebuhr, Gordon Kaufman and James Gustafson have really wrestled with that question. And so I don't even know if it was intentional on my part to end it with them. I mean, I can't remember anymore, right? As far as I know, there's only one historical error in the book, and that is when I make a comment about Constantine having made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. I should have worded that better. Constantine initiated the process by which Christianity eventually became the official religion of the Roman Empire, but he himself did not. But that was also a part of the problem that I had so few words I could use. I probably didn't intend to say what I said, but it was subsequently drawn to my attention that technically that was wrong. So I would go back and rewrite that sentence. Not too long ago, the editor at Fortress Press, another editor, not the one I originally worked with, asked me if I would consider revising the book into a larger book. And I haven't answered his question yet. If I did revise it, I would not only correct that particular mistake about Constantine that I told you about, I would have to include other theologians as well who did not get spoken about. There's one criticism I received from the book that represents a misunderstanding, but I would, if in a rewrite of the book, I would address it at the beginning so that my point of view was clear. Somebody criticized me for using sexist language about God, which is to say that throughout the book, up until I discuss feminist theology in the 20th century, I refer to God as he, and I use the masculine pronoun his. That's not because I endorse that language for God. It's simply because I was describing how other people used language about God and talked about God. My intention was not to reinforce masculine language for God, but simply if you're talking about the theology of Martin Luther or John Calvin, I mean, they consistently, for the most part, speak of God as he and him. And though, I point out that even John Calvin admitted the legitimacy of feminine images for God because he knew that they were in the Bible. I would just address that at the very beginning of the book. And I would probably also add something if in an expanded version of the book, why the Bible uses predominantly male language for God. And I think the answer to that is that ancient Israel's religion and theology originated in a polytheistic milieu in which Yahweh, the God of Israel, was originally a male deity who had a female consort before Israel became monotheistic. But then by the time that happens, more or less around the exile and shortly thereafter, the language is already in place. But, if you speak of a hymn, God as a hymn, and yet there is no other, I think the masculine language for God in the Bible is a vestige of Israel's polytheistic past, is what I would make that point clearly and in conjunction with my explanation that throughout this book, I'm going to use the language that my authors use until I get to, feminist theology, and then we'll talk about that, That's hard to say. I mean, there's so many of them. One of them is Schubert Ogden. I talked about process theology, but there are some significant differences between, say, the way John Cobb and Schubert Ogden develop process theology. There's an important issue between the two of them, between Cobb and Ogden, that is, as to how the metaphysical language of process theology should be understood, whether transcendentally with Ogden or as speculative with Cobb. And I would clarify that. I'd probably deal with Langdon Gilkey, who was a student of Paul Tillich and one of my teachers at the University of Chicago, just to round out. I think Langdon Gilkey gave a very good Tillichian response to the death of God theologies in the 1960s. Let me see, who else would I include in there? I may have mentioned Bultmann once, but I think I would have talked about the demythologizing debate, and because that's obviously about religious language for God. I'd have to give that some more thought. But even then, you can't deal with everybody, right? I have known many Korean students of theology here in the United States. And so I've learned something about Korea from them. So I can't really say much to Korean readers of my book because I don't have much firsthand knowledge of. Could I turn the question back on you three and ask, why did you think my book would be important to Korean readers that you translated it? Let me just say, the contrast with Alistair McGrath is exactly the contrast I was getting at earlier. Alistair McGrath's book on historical theology, I used it once in a class, but I would never use it again. It's assuming an orthodox understanding of Christian faith. My book is trying to do exactly the opposite. I don't mean that Orthodox Christian faith is necessarily false. Even an academic book like Alistair McGrath still shows the influence of that romanticized, nostalgic image of the past, in effect, is designed more to shut down critical questions than to open them up. I am very much a Chicago theologian. Yeah, I did my MDiv at Yale, and I did not find myself in the Yale theology. I have great problems with Lindbeck's and Fry's theology. I have far more respect for Karl Barth than I do for I don't believe that the Yale post-liberal theologians should have a right to consider themselves the disciples of Karl Barth, as they think they do. I did study with a Barthian in Germany before I encountered Yale theology. And I think that I'm not a Barthian, but I have great respect for Karl Barth, whereas I don't have much respect for the Yale post-liberal theology. I think that's a completely dead end. I think that's a complete dead end. And but please take up my offer anytime if you want to talk. We can talk about Karl Barth. We can talk about Yale post-liberal theology. Anything you want. I'm here at your disposal. Okay. And thank you for giving me this honor that you translated my book, that you read my book, and that you found it interesting and valuable. I can't thank you enough from the bottom of my heart. God bless you all.